Available everywhere podcasts are.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. We come back to another comment from Shep Easy's sweet spot before we get into our fourth segment of the day. Achane is an RB2 in my humble opinion. Now, I'm not saying that I'm not indicting Achane's abilities, but I just don't see how in fantasy a guy like Achane, if this makes any sense, will continue this production. That's always going to be my issue with him. When I look at my Miami as a whole, I just think that there's too reliant on the trait of speed to dominate teams. And it's not a bad thing if it wins you football games. As Jake Tucharchik also says, I figured Achane and Mosa will work for RB2 in a 12-man league. Just not enough running backs that are better. Yeah, I guess if your opinion is you're looking for a guy with explosiveness, then Achane or Mostert will work for you. But from my honest perspective, there are guys out there who I will rely upon, even though they might not put up as many fantasy points as potentially Achane or Mostert would, that just offer that modicum of balance to your team. If I am picking high, like I said, in the draft, and have got a running back, as Shep Easy Sweet Spot again says, Dolphins' screen game will help both of them. That's another interesting observation. My opinion in terms of the fantasy perspective is that there are guys who, in later rounds, should you have already gotten, say, McCaffrey, a Hall, guys of that nature, even a second-round pick, a high second-round pick, who you already know will get the bulk of your points. There will be guys in later rounds where you will be comfortable with them even though they might not get as many points because they supplement your starter. Achane and Mostert are too similar, or an offense that I think is just too competitive and speed heavy for me to truly invest in them as either RB1s or RB2s. That being said, out of either of them, if you had to give me a choice and force me to say which one I like better, it is Mostert, even though he is the older one. But thank you for your opinions. I appreciate them, even though I don't necessarily agree with all of them. They are fantastic comments and added a lot to the show. So thank you, both of you, for your comments. We're getting back into the wide receiver market here as we go to a wide receiver sleeper segment for today's show. I think that the wide receiver market is going to be very versatile in terms of how it's interpreted after drafts. These are all guys, the three guys that I have here, a couple of other guys as well, that I really think will add value to your team as the season goes on. These may not even be guys who are drafted in, say, 12-man leagues, 12-round drafts, but these are guys who add a lot of value in terms of what they could bring in a flex position off your bench any given week. So without further ado, let's jump right into them. And starting off with a guy, one of my favorites out of Seattle, Jackson Smith-Njigba. And what I love about Jackson Smith-Njigba is that even though people say he may not have had the best of rookie seasons, he sneakily had 63 catches for 625 yards and is quietly becoming a receiver Seattle believes they can rely upon. Now, it's going to be kind of an interesting situation in Seattle where maybe with the new look of their offense and the offensive coordinator change there, where it's always going to be about finding versatility in your targets. And even though outside of that top three there's not much depth there for Seattle, there certainly could be a lot more names being factored into the Seattle offense. Maybe a guy like Noah Fant gets a little more targets. Maybe even Jake Bobo gets a little more targets. So Jackson with a Jigba in the middle of that's my only concern for him. But as he grows, and as questions about Tyler Lockett ensue about whether or not he's going to have a future in Seattle or even in the league, he might get more wide receiver 2 looks. And I love him as well because he's not like your typical, if he will become wide receiver 2. He's a guy who is very versatile in his route running. He's not always looking for the deep ball, as you might expect out of guys lower down the roster. He's a guy who knows he's getting more comfortable with the structure of this offense, and I'm really intrigued to see what his year 2 will look like now that he has a year in his belt, and what Ryan Grubb will do with him in an offense that purportedly is going to be looking a little bit more versatile and scary this year. So JSN is someone who I might not draft immediately, but if he's out there on the waiver wire, you might want to stream him week by week. He's going to be someone who we have to take week by week or look at week by week to really determine him. So I think that he is a perfect start to this list in terms of guys who might not get drafted, but will still have a lot of value if you would like to stream them or even in later rounds of certain leagues. But going to another guy here, another guy who has a new home, new horizons for him, profiling as someone who, again, is going to be a speedster in this Carolina Panthers offense. So definitely might be a little bit wary there, at least in my humble opinion. But Deontay Johnson certainly looks like someone, if this Panthers offense can get figured out, if Bryce Young appreciates his weapons, develops a rapport with them, can get going here. He had 8.3 targets per game last year, throughout his career actually. So he gives a high volume of targets. And I think in this Panthers offense, even though, they're trying to get a more traditional offense, it is profiling as one that will utilize a little bit of speed. And I think Bryce Young will appreciate that, because I think that the problems that they had last year was getting separation. I don't think the receivers last year were trying their hardest to get open, but Deontay Johnson's speed will be a huge factor in that. If he can create separation just with his speed alone, look for him to get a lot of targets in this offense, and look for Bryce Young to become more comfortable as a result. Now, in terms of fantasy drafts and where he stands there, I don't necessarily think he's in that range either, along with JSN, in terms of whether or not they get drafted. I think he could go undrafted in a lot of different drafts. But at the end of the day, the bottom line is the Panthers are looking for someone. They're holding out for a hero in this offense, and Deontay Johnson could be that guy, should his speed be utilized in many various ways to allow Bryce Young that opportunity as well. But then another guy who I really like in an offense that might be a bit more competitive, but to add some variety to it, actually not yet. Let's talk about George Pickens before we get to Jameson Williams. George Pickens, like we talked about before, could potentially falter. This could potentially be a bust. He's a boom or bust guy. But the reason why I view him as a sleeper, and why others may view him as a sleeper, is because of the fact that, he is going to be the most integral part of this offense. He is going to be the true wide receiver one going forward, and no one will challenge him. Maybe Pat Freiermuth in certain situations will get some targets. Maybe Michael Pruitt steps up in this offense. But the bottom line is, I think that in order for this Pittsburgh offense to have any success, Russell Wilson will need to develop a rapport with George Pickens, and quickly. If that isn't the case, then both of them could be busts for his upcoming season. So he's perhaps the most volatile one out of this. He might be drafted over guys like JSN and Deontay Johnson. But I also think that he's a guy who will receive a lot more volume in terms of targets as well, which gives him the advantage over guys like JSN and Johnson. But our final guy for this segment is a guy, like I said, in Jameson Williams, who is in a competitive wide receiver room, in a competitive team overall. But I think the value that he adds, as we saw last year in spurts and flashes when he was playing, I think leads me to believe that the Lions will use him in many different ways that could get him a lot of yards fairly quickly. Now, if you look at the profile of the Lions, you obviously have Amon-Ra St. Brown, your wide receiver one. You have Sam Laporta, one of the most versatile young tight ends in the NFL. You have a guy in Khalif Raymond, who I like. Not used that often, but still could be interesting. But the overall profile of this Lions offense is becoming a little bit more balanced should Jameson Williams be the player they think he can be. I think he can be. And I think you should look for him in latter stages of drafts just because of the versatility he brings. He may not start for you every single week, but he may start for you in at least 40 to 50% of them because of the value he adds not only to the Lions offense but to fantasy football managers. So these four guys, like I said, they have a high floor, but they also have a low ceiling. Any one of these guys can be a bust. That's why they're considered sleepers. They're boom or bust potential. And our last team of the day is guys who I think will be busts. So, as you can see, that's how tenuous the wide receiver market is right now. But if I want to leave you with anything from this list of wide receivers, that each and every one of them has a trait or is in a situation that helps them. Let's talk about JSN a little bit more. He's in a situation where he's primed to get that wide receiver 2 position almost immediately. And if you look at Deontay Johnson, he's someone who immediately profiles as the wide receiver 1 in Carolina, or at least someone who adds a lot of value for Bryce Young. As Tap to Learn says, Jaden Reed or Christian Watson. Now, these are two guys who could be sleepers. They're both in a Packers wide receiver room that immediately is looking to be one of the most fun to diagnose in terms of fantasy. We also will talk about them a little later on next week. But this question is just one of how both of these guys look out of the gate and how, they grow into the season, because this is still young. Another thing to look at is that Christian Watson has an injury history, had a couple hamstring problems. Jaden Reed, has played more, has a more solid foundation, and out of camp, a lot of talk has been seeing them. As Tapton says, I don't see them as sleepers. They're both wide receiver 2s. That's a valid opinion. It just is a little bit contingent on Jordan Love and how Matt LaFleur balances these guys out. Because at the end of the day, I really like the excitement around both of them, but it's heavily based off of the optimism that either one of them could profile as a wide receiver 1. Because right now, both of these guys are in a situation where no one really knows who's going to emerge as the true number 1 target for Jordan Love. That's the only reason why I'm at an impasse here and agreeing with you, because of the profile of the Packers wide receiver room overall. In fantasy, they are a little bit more interesting. That being said, getting back to the overall question of which one I like more, I think it's Jaden Reed. There's been a little bit more hype about him out of camp, and I think that Jordan Love's going to be more confident in him. Christian Watson, I think that the injury risk is there, and it's heavily apparent. Wide receiver 1 on their roster, but wide receiver 2 on fantasy roster, says Tap to Learn again. I think that Jaden Reed, though, is the one who I'm more comfortable with. That being said, Christian Watson has and has had a lot more upside to him. So if you want to get absorbed into the hype of Christian Watson, I certainly think that the hype surrounding him kind of elevates his status a little bit. I'm still concerned about the injuries. Jaden Reed's the more confident one that I will take if I were a fantasy football manager and was looking for a guy to start. And he is. I'm willing to give in to the wide receiver 2 claims on this one. I think that he could be a wide receiver 2. But to close out this segment here, all of these sleepers that I mentioned are guys who, in certain situations, could potentially be huge hits, but also could be kind of potentially in the bust conversation, which brings me to my last segment, which will be wide receiver bust, which will come right after this short break.